The archetype of the self is one of the more confusing concepts in Jungian psychology, and one which perplexed me ever since I read about it. The archetype exists, no doubt. Symbols of it can be seen everywhere. But I found its exact function within the psyche very hard to understand, and I began to think that Jung was wrong for positing such a thing. However, as I carefully studied the archetype, its function became clearer, and I began to realize why this archetype was of the utmost importance for human society, as well as the complex symbolism which attempts to depict it. This also made it possible to understand why symbols which depict the self archetype often become revered by humanity, for better or for worse. The self is, in short, the entirety of the psyche: consciousness, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. This means that a person's self includes who they are at a fundamental genetic level, i.e., their instincts, what I sometimes refer to as the archetypal self. This archetypal self, however, is not the entirety of the psyche, since a substantial portion of the psyche is built from your experiences in life. Your conscious ego, for instance, is shaped by a large number of factors which are largely external, and so don't originate directly from your genome. Despite this, your consciousness is still a part of yourself, because it is contained by your psyche. This even includes the language you speak and the vocabulary you use, since these aren't given to you by your genetics, but by your society. The self also includes the personal unconscious, which are aspects of your unconscious mind which unknowingly affect your behavior, but which also aren't derived from your genes. Past traumatic experiences are a good example, since these are often forgotten later in life, but may lead to certain phobias or anxieties, and so continue to have an influence upon the psyche. It is important to note that the self is a psychic entity. We draw a distinction between the psyche and the body, since the purpose of psychology is to study the psyche. The psyche and the body do interact and depend upon each other, but the psyche is the amalgamation of the subjective experience, i.e., thoughts, emotions, sensations, and feelings, whereas the body is made up of the physical matter which comprises you. This idea, that the body and psyche are related, but are fundamentally distinct, is known as the reality of the psyche, and it is a challenging but very rewarding concept once you understand it. This means that the things which arise from your unconscious psyche, such as your dreams, are a part of you. The people you encounter in your dreams exist inside your mind, and so form a part of yourself, even if they feel like autonomous external forces. At first glance, it may seem that the self isn't an archetype per se, but rather a concept, and this is true to an extent. But the operation of the archetype is to restore balance to the psyche whenever one part of the psyche conflicts with another. The self, being the entirety of the psyche, anticipates the possibility that different aspects may have competing interests, and can detect psychic disharmony. There are two axes along which this idea applies: the front-back axis and the left-right axis. The front-back axis has to do with the general polarity between consciousness and the unconscious mind, particularly the personal shadow. This polarity has to do with the fact that the conscious mind is largely shaped by external ideas and beliefs. Your cultural background, as well as your specific circumstances, play a part in forming your self-concept, which creates a sense of boundary between the self and the external world. Our moral beliefs, which can differ from culture to culture, are also bound with the conscious personality. The conscious personality has a limited scope because consciousness actually narrows our attention to certain aspects of the world which are deemed important. It is through the conscious mind that human beings can conscientiously strive for higher values, and to an extent inhibit the unconscious mind. You may feel like breaking the rules out of convenience, but your higher moral principles can cause you to abstain from this. Note, however, that the development of a conscious ego means restricting the unconscious personality in certain ways. You may want to eat something tasty, but your higher conscious intention to eat healthy may cause you to select something with less calories, and against the wishes of the more unconscious side of the personality. This means that within every human being, there is a conflict between society's moral, conscientious values and the unconscious, which possesses its own animal drives. This conflict is actually quite dangerous, since the more we battle against the unconscious, the more it will fight back in order to assert itself. As Jung writes, the will can control them only in part. It may be able to suppress them, but it cannot alter their nature, and what is suppressed comes up again in another place, in altered form, but this time loaded with a resentment that makes the otherwise harmless natural impulse our enemy. You may be a nice person, but your niceness may come with repressing your feelings of resentment, which will sooner or later boil over at the worst possible time. Such is the case with people who try to repress their rage in societies where anger is discouraged. This problem is made worse by the fact that most people see themselves as their egos, and so are not aware of the true personality, but rather only of the ego, which conceals a significant portion of what the person actually is. The concealment creates a personal shadow, which includes aspects of the personality, which are difficult to accept since they contradict the ego's version of the self concept. The self archetype is a system which recognizes when there is a conflict in the psyche, and attempts to bring these two aspects back into alignment, thus restoring psychic harmony. It does this by making one conscious of their shadow, so that the boundaries of the ego can be extended. This is a vital process, which allows a person to come to terms with their shadow side, while also not abandoning their moral beliefs. Normally, we project unconscious contents onto others, but it is by withdrawing such projections that we gain a better understanding of who we truly are. The archetype of the self does not attempt to destroy the ego in favor of the archetypal self. Rather, it tries to harmonize these conflicting aspects, so that our moral beliefs can be balanced with our darker, but ultimately more natural impulses, which arise from the unconscious. The symbols which arise from the unconscious attempt to draw the attention of the conscious ego towards aspects of the psyche which were hitherto ignored. What you experience in a dream may seem irrelevant to your waking life, but in dreams, we often discover complexes, which secretly influence our thought patterns. The self is able to detect an imbalance of the psyche, and its function is to restore equilibrium. This is why the archetype appears as symbols of unity between opposites, of wholeness, and of psychological transformation. One such symbol is the Mandala, of which Jung writes, "Their basic motif is a premonition of a center of personality, a kind of central point within the psyche, to which everything is related, by which everything is arranged, and which is itself a source of energy. The energy of the central point is manifested in the almost irresistible compulsion and urge to become what one is, just as every organism is driven to assume the form that is characteristic of its nature, no matter what the circumstances. This center is not felt or thought of as the ego, but, if one may so express it, as the self. Although the center is represented by an innermost point, it is surrounded by a periphery containing everything that belongs to the self, the paired opposites that make up the total personality. This totality comprises consciousness first of all, then the personal unconscious, and finally an indefinitely large segment of the collective unconscious, whose archetypes are common to all mankind. Therefore, the archetype and the symbols which it produces are meant to restore harmony to the psyche by making the unconscious conscious. As we do so, it becomes possible to adapt our lives to fit the circumstances of our existence. We may find an outlet for our anger, or a way to deal with our insecurities without judgment. Adapting to the world is made easier by conscious self-reflection, and by illuminating the often veiled and dark aspects of the psyche. In this way, the entire psyche can be harmonized. The mechanism which enables a higher consciousness is actually related to the second divided axis. The second pole along which psychic harmony can be restored is the left-right axis. This roughly corresponds to the left and right hemispheres of the brain, which can also experience disunity whenever they conflict. The psychological traits associated with Jung's concept of the anima are very similar to the disposition of the right hemisphere, while the left hemisphere possesses traits which are highly characteristic of Jung's animus concept. Therefore, there is good reason to suppose that these two opposed psychological concepts reflect the natural opposition between the left and right hemisphere of the brain, and Jung foreshadowed this numerous times when discussing the conflict between anima and animus. Whoever identifies with an intellectual standpoint will occasionally find his feeling confronted like an enemy in the guise of the anima. Conversely, an intellectual animus will make violent attacks on the feeling standpoint. Therefore, anyone who wants to achieve the difficult feat of realizing something not only intellectually, but according to its feeling value, must for better or worse come to grips with the anima-animus problem, in order to open the way for a higher union, a conjunctio oppositorum. This is an indispensable prerequisite for wholeness. Jung realized that a substantial source of conflict in the psyche stems from the conflict between masculine and feminine sides. This is closely associated with the conflict between conscious and unconscious, since the left side is associated with consciousness, and the right with the unconscious. But in truth, both sides are needed for consciousness, and important aspects of consciousness are lost if either hemisphere is damaged. The potential for conflict between the left and right hemisphere has to do with the different psychological attitudes which the hemispheres have, namely the logos of the left hemisphere, which is more intellectual, and the Eros principle of the right hemisphere, which is more emotional. Oftentimes, one or the other attempts to override each other, when in actuality it is much more beneficial to have them working in concert with one another, since the union of these two separate perspectives actually allows us to comprehend the world more deeply. The archetype of the self, being the entire psyche, seeks to resolve the conflict between masculine and feminine, since they work optimally when unified rather than divided. The animus is good at re-representing things which have been previously experienced, which allows it to stick with the preformed plan. But this self-referential nature can cause a person to be locked into a particular way of thinking. In contrast, the anima is more emotional and able to think more flexibly, but because of this, has difficulty sticking with higher goals, since its emotional nature allows it to be easily thrown off task. This conflict, just like the conflict between the ego and the shadow, causes a disharmony in the psyche, to which the self-archetype attempts to restore balance. Because of their opposing psychological attitudes, it may be difficult for a person to function, since they are being compelled by contradictory forces. This state of disorientation may manifest as an inability to be productive, an inability to think flexibly, and these can lead to states of mind such as depression and anxiety. To restore balance, the self-archetype attempts to communicate between the hemispheres, so that an understanding can be reached. Naturally, balance will be restored, though it often comes at the cost of considerable disorientation, as occurs during ego death. A less costly restoration would be the deliberate understanding of feminine and masculine sides of the psyche, which allows the conscious ego to understand when either of these archetypes are influencing the psyche. When somebody is being stubbornly opinionated, we may suspect the influence of the animus, whereas when one is being overly emotional, it is likely due to anima possession. The symbols created by the self attempt to reveal the ways in which these aspects influence us, giving the conscious attitude the capacity to correct course. The union of the masculine and feminine sides of the psyche is represented symbolically as the divine child, who is born from the blending of opposites. It is easy to see why the symbolic union of opposites is a symbol of the self. However, the interaction between feminine and masculine in the psyche is also what enables the transformation of the ego. The left side is closely associated with the ego, since masculinity is responsible for the narrowing of the conscious window. But when the masculine side weakens, the feminine side, which is much more emotional, open, receptive, and less individualistic, makes it possible for consciousness to expand and become solidified by the left side. Thus, the interaction of masculine and feminine is what makes consciousness possible in the first place, and it also enables us to adapt to changing psychological circumstances. The self-archetype functions to make as much of the psyche conscious as possible, since this enables us to correct course whenever there is a psychic imbalance. The self-archetype is also revealed by symbols of transformation, since the growth of consciousness is a dynamic process. This is why the journey of the hero in myths also symbolizes the growing consciousness of the self and coming to terms with the shadow. The self also appears in symbols, which demonstrate the polarity between the ego and the rest of the psyche. As stated before, it is very common for a person to think of themselves as synonymous with their egos, but the self-archetype attempts to present parts of the psyche which are not subordinate to the ego. This is why the idea of God points to the self-archetype. Gods are products of human psychology, but they stand apart from the ego, almost like an external force controlling us. The symbol of the god points us to the unconscious areas of the psyche, which are perceived to have their own will, and which act independently of the ego. This is one possible reason why the symbol of God corresponds historically with mankind's growing self-awareness, since such a symbol makes one aware of psychic forces beyond the ego. Another interesting aspect of the self is that it fundamentally seeks a situation in which it can be itself. In other words, it seeks the freedom to act according to one's own values. This is also seen in the hero's myth. Whenever a hero displaces a tyrannical figure, such as their father or an evil king. This is because authority prevents us from being ourselves by imposing societal edicts upon us. Such standards inevitably become a part of ourselves when they become adopted by the ego, but oftentimes we develop our own values and beliefs, which are not in line with society's values and beliefs. This desire to be oneself is why the self ultimately desires freedom. This impulse actually stems from our evolutionary origins, demonstrating that even this impulse is extremely ancient. It corresponds with the desire to be the alpha male or female amidst the troop, since by occupying this top position, There is no authority to rule you, and so you can, in a sense, be yourself. The self constantly seeks full expression of its own individuality, and the stages which represent the attainment of this freedom are very commonly depicted in mythology. This is why great men are often deified, because at some level, they represent the self's desire for autonomy and freedom of expression. Apart from the geometrical and arithmetical symbols, a powerful person is the commonest symbol of the self. It is either a god or a godlike human being, a prince, a priest, a great man, an historical personality, a dearly loved father, an admired example, the successful elder brother. In short, a figure that transcends the ego personality of the dreamer. There are corresponding feminine figures in a woman's psychology. Such historical figures, like Julius Caesar or William the Conqueror, are admired because of the self-archetype projecting onto such figures, who were so powerful that they could impose their own will in order to shape society according to their image. Such individuals point us to who we could be if we weren't constrained by authority, and the self's desire for autonomy causes it to gravitate towards such figures, which is why we may be infatuated with certain celebrities. The self unconsciously desires such power, since this will enable it to be free from the control of others. But individuals who embody the self can easily exert a controlling influence over others, who project this desire rather than embodying it. This is why autocrats can effortlessly sway the minds of the people, since the archetype can exert a powerful influence when projected onto leaders. The last thing which is worth noting about the self-archetype is that it is constantly shifting in relation to the moral progress of mankind. As we become more morally developed, the conflict between the animal within and the ego will become likely more difficult, and yet without this battle, the world can never become a better place. This is the goal of psychology, to become conscious of what we are at a fundamental level, so that we can continue to advance as moral beings. We need to know what we are in order to be well equipped for the inevitable moral challenges of human life. The moral beliefs we adopt are also a part of ourselves, and so to sacrifice our morality is to sacrifice ourselves. The moral heights which we attain cause an inflation of our egos and a greater conflict within the psyche, and so individuation is necessarily followed by psychological turmoil. Yet this turmoil is the price we pay for a better world, and so one who voluntarily accepts this burden is able to transcend his own humanity. The struggle to balance these moral heights with our archetypal selves constitutes the story of mankind, and I believe that knowledge of this fundamental archetypal pattern serves to further develop the human species, as we continue to evolve towards the spiritual heights.